Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the concluding program of the 2020 Conrad E. Wright Research Conference, sponsored by the Massachusetts Historical Society. My name is Kennesaw Wong Street Chanelai, and I'm the Director of Research at the MHS. I am joined today by Katie Morris, the Historical Society's Assistant Director of Research, who will be helping me run everything on the back end. For today's session, we shall be using Zoom's webinar functions. If you have a question for our panelists, please use the Q&A function to ask it, and we shall try to get to as many questions as we can at the end of the program. We have a very special program for you today as we wrap up a conversation that we began last October. This conference could not have been made possible without all the great presenters and commenters, as well as our conference committee members, Professors Allison Lang and Christian Simido. Before we get to the panelists, it is my pleasure to introduce the president of the Massachusetts Historical Society, Catherine Allgor, who would like to say a few words of welcome.
Thank you so much, Kid, and welcome to everybody on this beautiful day. So we have a long tradition at the Historical Society of having conferences every 2 years or so, but the one in 2020 was going to be historic because for the first time ever, it had a title. Thanks to a very generous gift by Judge Levin Campbell, this was going to be not just our usual every 2-year conference, but the first Conrad E. Wright conference for 2020, and named, of course, for our beloved former research director and present Sibley's editor. And I can call him beloved, and I won't embarrass him because I think he might be actually watching football at this moment. And it was a great 2020 was historic because it was an election year. And here we were with two things to commemorate, the Sesquicentennial and Centennial of the ratification of two critical amendments about voting rights. It was all perfect. Then, as you know, it got even more historic when we had to switch, we actually delay the conference and then switch and do it online. And so it set another kind of record. It was the first time we have ever done that. And we had a great success, I have to say, even though the conference, it was always disappointing not to be in person. And we look forward to welcoming you all back to the building, 11:54 sooner rather than later. The truth was we got so many people. We got people from all around the world. And I think our farthest reach points were New Zealand, Japan, France, and Canada. So that was really great. So here we are. Again, we had sort of hoped maybe to at least do this hybrid, so be partly in person, but it is all on Zoom. But honestly, we need to wrap up this wonderful conference before the next one. That one's scheduled for July 2022. And the topic is Underrepresented Voices of the American Revolution, just as we're about to mark the 250th of American independence. So it was definitely time to do this, but I'm looking forward to the conversation. And I want to thank Allison Parker, my old pal, Lisa Tetrault, my other old pal, and Alex Keyssar, my new friend, for moderating. Kid, back to you.
Thank you so much, Catherine. It's my pleasure now to introduce the presenters for today. So Professor Parker and then Professor Tetrault will have about 20 minutes each to talk about their papers. Then Professor Keyssar will moderate a conversation between them before we open the floor up to questions and comments from the audience members. So first to today's panelists. Allison M Parker is Chair and Richards Professor of American History at the University of Delaware. She is co-chair of the University of Delaware's Anti-Racism Initiative. She also has a joint appointment with the Women and Gender Studies Department. Her work focuses on the intersections of gender, race, disability, citizenship, and law in United States history. Her most recent book is Unceasing Militant: The Life of Mary Church Tetrault. She is also the author of Articulating Rights, 19th Century American Women on Race, Reform, and the State, and Purifying America, Women, Cultural Reform, and Pro-Censorship Activism, 1873 to 1933. She has co-edited 3 anthologies and authored numerous essays and book chapters. Professor Parker is the founding editor of the Gender and Race in American History book series for the University of Rochester Press. Her next project is a study of civil rights activist Mary Hamilton, the first female field director for the Congress of Racial Equality. She will be joined today by Professor Lisa Tetrault, Associate Professor in the Department of History at Carnegie Mellon University. An historian of gender, race, American democracy, social movements, and memory, her first book, The Myth of Seneca Falls, Memory and the Women's Suffrage Movement, 1848 to 1898, won the Organization of American Historians' inaugural Mary Nicholas Women's History Book Prize. She is currently working on 2 book projects. The first, a celebrated but misunderstood amendment, is a study of the long life of the 19th Amendment rather than a traditional examination of the movement that led to it. The second is Enter Women's Suffrage, a new history of Reconstruction, 1865 to 1878, which examines debates about women's voting during the Reconstruction era. Professor Tetrault delivered the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery's Votes for Women exhibit keynote address and consults with various historical organizations about women's suffrage programs. She has held fellowships from multiple institutions, including the Massachusetts Historical Society. The program today is moderated by Alex Keyssar. He is the Matthew W. Sterling Jr. Professor of History and Social Policy at Harvard's Kennedy School. His work explores how historical problems have contemporary policy implications, and he is the author of several books, including Out of Work, The First Century of Unemployment in Massachusetts, The Right to Vote, The Contested History of Democracy in the United States, which was named the best book in U.S. history by the American Historical Association and was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. His most recent publication is Why Do We Still Have the Electoral College? Again, we shall start with Professor Parker, and then Professor Tetrault, and then Professor Keyssar will moderate the next portion of the program. So first, we go to Delaware with Professor Parker.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here. I really appreciate the invitation from the Massachusetts Historical Society and am honored to participate. I have so much to say today, and so does Lisa. And when we were talking about this, we decided that we would focus in on what kinds of stories we have and what kinds of stories we will tell. And I'm going to go in a more case study type of way, and then she's going to take a broader look at how this works. And so that's our approach. Basically, what I'll be doing is presenting a brief case study of the Black suffragist and feminist and civil rights activist, Mary Church Terrell. And I am going to be focusing on her voting rights activism to highlight 2 important stories in our history of the US suffrage movement. The first one is one that Black women's historians from Rosalind Terborg Penn to Martha Jones have successfully highlighted. It is the story of Black women's insistence on fighting simultaneously for Black men's access to the vote, as well as votes for women. It includes Black women's calls for the full enforcement of the 14th and 15th and later the 19th Amendments. Then I will call attention to the way popular culture and even many historians are still telling the story of the 1913 National Women's Suffrage Parade in a somewhat narrow and misleading way. Although the National Parade is just one moment in suffrage history, it has outsized importance given its iconic status as the first national mass direct action protest for women's voting rights. We need to get the story right, but it's a story that continues to be surprisingly impervious to all the revisionist histories we have reviewed and produced during the 19th Amendment's suffrage centennial. Both of these stories highlight Black women's centrality to the voting rights movement and force us to tell a more inclusive and honest tale. The Black Women's National Club movement came of age in the 1890s during the peak of lynchings in the US and a post-Reconstruction continued push to systematically spread Jim Crow and to disenfranchise Black men throughout the South, thus leading Black club women to identify the struggle for the vote as a way to insist upon the full recognition of their citizenship rights for all African Americans. For Black women, The Votes for Women campaign was always inseparable from questions of Black men's disenfranchisement and the broader Black freedom struggle. To highlight this story, I'd like to start with a brief example from the narrative that Mary Church Terrell told about her own life. She was educated at Oberlin College and then spent 2.5 years studying abroad in the late 1880s. In Europe, she received several marriage proposals from white men and seriously considered one of them, despite her reluctance to marry outside of her race or to pass as white. When explaining her decision to not marry one of these Europeans, Terrell focused on something we might not expect, on the Reconstruction era amendments. I thought of the rights, privileges, and immunities cold-bloodedly withheld from colored people in the United States, which practically everybody is allowed to enjoy. I thought how they are disenfranchised in that section of the country where the majority live, in spite of the 14th and 15th Amendments, while the whole country looks on with utter indifference at this flagrant violation of the Constitution, and thus, by reprehensible silence and connivance, actually gives its consent. The injustices and discriminations of many kinds rushed through my mind like a flood. It's my country, I said indignantly. I have a perfect right to love it, and I will. My African ancestors helped to build and enrich it with their labor for nearly 300 years, while they were shackled body and soul in the most cruel bondage the world has ever known. But it is my country, and with all its faults, I love it still. Dedicating herself to the fight for civil rights, Terrell returned to the United States and in 1891 married Robert Terrell, a formerly enslaved man who had graduated from Harvard University and who was a strong supporter of women's suffrage and of women's organized activism. Starting in the early 1890s, Mary Church Terrell began attending National American Woman Suffrage Association meetings, trying to elicit white women's support for a more holistic view of voting rights. As much as they were committed to gaining women's voting rights, she and other Black suffragists were committed to restoring the voting rights Black men had gained with the 14th and 15th Amendments, but had lost with the Jim Crow laws, such as the poll taxes and unfair literacy tests that disenfranchised them. With Terrell as their first president, members of the National Association of Colored Women, or NACW, came together to defend Black womanhood by combating the intersecting forces of sexism and racism. And this is a picture from 1896 with Terrell over here in the hat with the fruit and flowers. And over here is Ida B. Wells with Barnett with her new baby, Charles Barnett, who's in the arms of Alice Dunbar Nelson. So this is quite a remarkable portrait. But as part of their broader freedom struggle, for instance, Terrell and other NACW leaders petitioned in 1908 for a constitutional amendment extending the vote to women and asked for protections for Black men's voting rights. One section of the petition resolved that we, the members of the Equal Suffrage League, representing the National Association of Colored Women through its suffrage department, in the interest of enfranchisement and taxation with representation, asked to have enacted such legislation as will enforce the 14th and 15th Amendments of the Constitution of our country throughout all its sections. The signatories wanted Black men to truly be able to vote. They realized that any new woman suffrage amendment would be immediately undermined, especially in the South, just as the 14th and 15th Amendments had been, unless Congress passed strong and effective enforcement provisions and the relevant government agencies actually enforced them. As Terrell explained, if one section of this country is permitted to trample with impunity upon any provision of the Constitution with which it takes issue, another will surely resort to the same expedient to render null and void any section or clause to which it is opposed. The violation of one fundamental law invariably leads to the infraction of another. When Mary Church Terrell traveled on the lecture circuit in the early 1900s, she provocatively but accurately claimed to her white audiences that white Southern members of Congress were only in office because they had illegally disenfranchised Black men. But Northern whites denied that Black men's access to the vote had been eviscerated throughout the South by the end of Reconstruction. In a typical exchange, a white Bostonian challenged Terrell's assertion that he would need only a few thousand votes to get elected to Congress from Mississippi because colored men were disenfranchised in that state. The Bostonian asked, "What has become of the 14th Amendment?" with a fine show of indignation. When I told him that the 14th Amendment had been null and void, not only in Mississippi, but in the other Southern states for years, he replied, "Walk softly, Mrs. Terrell, walk softly when you declare that an amendment to the Constitution is so flagrantly violated as you claim it is." Even after I gave him definite facts and figures, he showed plainly that he thought I was either greatly exaggerating the facts or was not telling the truth. Complacency and outright denial allowed Northern whites to imagine that the Reconstruction amendments were still in force, that they had done their duty to freed people and their descendants, and that they could and should do no more. Black suffragists like Terrell demanded that white women understand and embrace the linked cause of securing and enforcing voting rights for all. Yet white suffragists were not consistent or reliable allies. As they tried to expand the suffrage movement throughout the white South, they hoped to distance themselves from the controversial stance of fighting for African American voting rights. Anti-suffragists linked the 15th Amendment with the Force Bill and claimed it was part of an anti-states' rights, anti-white Southern agenda. White Southerners and conservatives opposed the ratification of and then the enforcement of the 19th Amendment, claiming that voting rights for African Americans could lead to racial equality or to what they called social equality, implying the dreaded prospect of interracial marriage. Later, in the 1920s and early 1930s, most Black women opposed the repeal of the 18th Amendment that banned the sale of alcohol, in part because they feared that the repeal of any constitutional amendment would set a dangerous precedent that would put at risk the 14th, 15th, and 19th Amendments. So, this first story highlights Black women's intersectional consciousness and the refusal to separate out their simultaneous campaigns for gender and racial equality. Now I'll shift gears toward the second story that I'd like to highlight. Black suffragists like Mary Church Terrell also found more militant and direct activism appealing. Terrell had long known of and admired the radical tactics employed by the British suffragettes. For instance, she had recorded in her 1909 diary, "In the evening, I went to hear Mrs. Emmeline Pankhurst, the militant suffragette, and enjoyed her address immensely." In 1913, Terrell and Black suffragists eagerly joined in a major direct action in the US when Alice Paul and Lucy Burns organized a huge suffrage parade for the National American Woman Suffrage Association on March 3rd, 1913, the day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. As I said at the beginning, I'm going to take some time to tell the story of what really happened at this march, because despite the great work that some Black women's historians uncovered years ago, and despite excellent new work by scholars like Kathleen Cahill, it's something that most folks have missed. Cahill points out that Marie Bottineau Baldwin, a Chippewa from North Dakota, marched in the parade. Because she did not march in traditional regalia, but rather in her cap and gown as a graduate of the Washington College of Law, she was not recognized as a Native American participant. Cahill also points out that a Mrs. Wu stood on a float representing nations of the world working toward women's suffrage, proudly carrying the flag of the new Chinese Republic, and was identified by the organizers as a real Chinese woman. Women of other sovereign nations were also involved. As most of us have known, white suffrage leaders, especially Alice Paul, a young college-educated Quaker, tried at first to exclude and then to segregate Black women to pacify Southern white suffragists. Most historical and popular culture accounts correctly described the anti-lynching activist and suffragist Ida B. Wells Barnett's refusal to march in a segregated delegation at the back of the parade, and rightly celebrate her defiant insertion of herself into the otherwise all-white Illinois delegation. What is less well known is that this was not a solitary act of one defiant woman. From what I had learned of Tetrault as I was writing my biography of her, it seemed implausible that she had agreed to march segregated at the back. So I decided to research her participation more carefully. It turned out, as I mentioned, that a few Black women's historians had already established that many dozens of Black women marched all throughout the first suffrage parade in the nation's capital, but this story has not stuck. Those Black suffragists who joined state delegations were indeed at the back, but only because organizers had a carefully choreographed chart for the parade and planned for all of the states to assemble there. A Black Chicago newspaper captured the scene that day. The equal suffrage parade was viewed by many thousand people from all parts of the United States. No color line existed in any part of it. Afro-American women proudly marched right by the side of the white sisters. Tetrault served as a mentor to Howard University's new Delta Sigma Theta sorority, whose members organized to take an active role in politics and reform movements, starting with their participation in the march. Tetrault, who wrote the oath for the Deltas and became an honorary lifetime member, told of negotiating with Alice Paul on their behalf. The members wanted to march together. The key question was whether they would be able to march along with the other contingents of college women. A telegraph from the National American Woman Suffrage Association to Alice Paul on the day of the parade capitulated to protests from Black women, agreeing that they could march without restrictions. Tetrault explained that when some of the white suffragists still objected to having the colored girls of Howard University march in the parade, it was Tetrault's friend, the lawyer and suffragist Inez Mulholland, who insisted that they be given a place with the pupils of the other schools. So, dressed in their caps and gowns, the 25 Howard University Deltas marched alongside the other college delegations, not at the back. Mary Beard, the feminist and progressive US historian, invited Tetrault and other NACW members to stride alongside the New York City Woman Suffrage Party, which they did. Black women even carried the state banners for New York and Michigan. As Carrie Clifford recounted in the NAACP's The Crisis, Black suffragists marched as artists, homemakers, trained nurses, teachers, doctors, writers, club women, college graduates, college students, and musicians, among others. An editorial by NAACP leader W.B. Du Bois described the politics surrounding the participation of Black suffragists. The Women's Suffrage Party had a hard time settling on the status of the Negroes in the Washington parade. Finally, an order went out to segregate them in the parade, but telegrams and protests poured in, and eventually the colored women marched according to their state and occupation without let or hindrance. Du Bois captured the fluidity and chaos of the situation, as well as the resolve of the Black women who organized, protested, and won the capitulation of the white suffragists. If we better understood that Black suffragists collectively fought for and won the right to participate throughout, we would have a different story to tell of Black women's pivotal role in the suffrage movement. We made some strides in telling this story during the recent 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, but the myths and confusions surrounding Black women's participation still regularly appear, especially in popular culture renditions of Black women's place in the suffrage movement. It is not surprising that people gravitate to a simplistic story with a clear narrative arc and one heroine, the story that only Ida B. Wells Barnett defied the segregation strictures while all others capitulated. But it is not accurate. When they took their rightful places throughout the parade, African-American women suffragists acted with assurance and pride. Their determined activism helped ensure that the 19th Amendment would enfranchise Black and white women. After all, it was ratified, and after it was ratified, they continued their fight to enforce the 14th, 15th, and 19th Amendments for all African-Americans. I hope that we can all start telling this new story. Thank you.
I'm Lisa Tetrault. I'm going to go next. Thanks, Allison, for leading us into this and showing us some of the specifics on the ground. I'm now going to pull out and make 4 different points that came out of the broader work during the centennial and also work that I did myself. Let me just do the awkward thing of sharing my slides. So I think one thing that became very clear over the centennial was that the 1848 to 1920 narrative doesn't capture very well the story of women in voting. It may capture something that we talk about as women's suffrage, which I think we can perhaps now identify as really the 19th Amendment or the fight for the 19th Amendment, but there is a much, much broader fight for women in voting rights. And the two are not equivalent. And I know I've spent a lot of time undoing the idea that 1848 was the beginning of women's rights in the United States, or at least has this vaulted status. That 1848 to 1920 narrative doesn't really ring true for a lot of women of color. And so you get maps like this now that are starting to put asterisks kind of by 1920 saying not all women got the right to vote. And that, I think, is the first point, is that we can't reduce this story to the 1848 to the 1920 story anymore. That is a bounded kind of fight in some ways, if we want to make it, for some people, but it is not the fight for all people. And one of the things Stanton and Anthony and other people did was take their fight and map it onto all people, the work of my first book. And that just is not viable. And in some ways, I think we can also question at this point whether or not the term women's suffrage should even be used to encapsulate the broader story, or whether women's suffrage itself should be for the fight for the 19th Amendment and these people who identified as suffragists, and then really a broader fight for voting rights, which involved often women. And so the reason you often see this asterisk then is because people will say that this claim that was, propounded in 1920, that it gives women of the entire nation vote this fall, this absolute absence and erasure of women of color here, and even of some poor women, or things that come up now. If you're on the Google will continue to perpetuate this story in ardocuments.gov, that it granted women the right to vote and it guarantees all women the right to vote. And of course, it does no such thing, which is my second point. And my second point is that this asterisk actually has a lot more qualifications that we should add to it. The second point being that nobody won the right to vote. And this is what I've been working on lately. It turns out that the way we talk about voting rights in the United States is in this kind of homogenous way. And it misleads us because we don't qualify what the legal basis of that voting right is. We think that if we have won a voting right, we have been invested with something, that we are guaranteed something, that we have been invested with a right that we possess, which may not be abridged unless, on reasonable grounds. And it turns out that's not true. There is no voting right in the United States Constitution, and none of the amendments that have been added to it grant anyone a right to vote. So I'm starting to qualify my own language and not say anymore that women won the right to vote, or Black women won the right to vote, or Native American women won the right to vote. And I'm using that language much more specifically for fights that people launch for rights that what I call positive voting rights, one that the people possess. Those have been consistently defeated across US history, and I'll talk more about that. The Constitution at its founding punted on the idea of creating a right to vote. It was debated and then passed on. And what happened was that the Constitution delegates authority to the states to create voters. in the absence of any right that the people possess. So what the states do is that they then draw up voter criteria, the things you have to be in order to be a voter. And those are simultaneously disenfranchisement techniques, right? Because they are, you must be male, you must be white, you must pay a poll tax, you must whatever. And by the 1820s and 30s, all states in the United States required that voters be both white and male. And that's why women can't vote, because of the word male, okay? And for many people, it would also be because of the word white. And what I want to point out is that the women's rights movement of the 1850s, which is why I say I don't even know how we want to, if we want to even think of 1848 to 1920 as a seamless fight, because in some ways it's not. These people would have never demanded a constitutional amendment. They fought at the state level, not just because it was a tactical choice, but because they knew that the Constitution had nothing to do with voting rights. You wouldn't use the Constitution for voting rights. So where does this idea come from? It comes out of the American Civil War, 100 years after the United States creation and after its perpetuity after the war. Congress decides to take up one of freed people's demands, which is creating a so-called voting right. And they do propose that there be a positive assertion that citizens have a right to vote that shall not be denied or abridged by the states. That gets no teeth, and nobody supports it. And what happens instead is that we get the first idea that you can use the Constitution to create voting rights, or what I call voting access, but not by actually granting anyone a right to vote. If we look at the language of the 15th Amendment, it says you may not discriminate in voting on the count of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. You'll see it doesn't mention Black men at all. It's in the negative. What it says is you cannot use states. It actually stipulates it's federal power regulating the states may not use that word white to create voters. And thereby, that's why Black women were not included in this, because male was still there at the state level. So in other words, this confers nothing on anyone, and that's going to become important as we move forward, is that we know there was a famous fight, a split in the movement, Black women basically saying, we cannot have this fight. And this group, we often talked about this as a tactical difference, but it's actually a matter of constitutional interpretation that has much broader implications for the United States. These two say the 15th Amendment, we oppose it because we support white women first, but we do think it is federalized suffrage, and therefore we should fight for voting at the federal level. Lucy Stone says, no, the 15th Amendment was no constitutional change in the governance over voting. It was a war measure, and we must continue to fight for it at the state level because that's the only legal and lawful way to achieve suffrage. So let's look at the 16th Amendment. It's modeled exactly on the 15th Amendment. The right to citizens to vote, which is a fiction, does not exist in any legal, shall not be denied or abridged on account of sex instead of race or color. And so that is the language that eventually passes the US Congress 50 years later in 1919, and then gets ratified in 1920. And as you'll see, even though we say that guarantees women the right to vote, if we look at that language again, no one is guaranteed anything. In fact, women are not mentioned in the document. So the second point I want to make here is that nobody wins a right to vote in the way we imagine it. And I think that's something we have to start changing our language around. I now start talking about a bunch of women gained access to voting with the 19th Amendment, but they did not win the right to vote. That remains in many ways a very unfinished history and has still never been won. Now, because it was not won, not everyone enters voting, as we know, in 1920, because the states, after the 15th Amendment, realized by the 1890s that the North is not interested in enforcing the 15th Amendment. So as long as they skirt the use of the word race, the states still have an infinite slate of possibilities before them to disenfranchise people of color. So what they start doing in the 1890s is all those freed people who voted after the American Civil War are subject now to things called poll taxes or literacy tests, which are racial in their application, but don't ever mention the word race, and therefore are technically legal because they're not violating the 15th Amendment. Because the states, remember, have still been given the right to discriminate. And the 19th Amendment does not change that. So that means that a lot of women of color are still caught up in these racially discriminatory practices, which technically don't mention race, therefore are legal. And the third point I want to make is that there is no one point at which women actually gain access to voting. So dates for gaining access to voting vary widely. One of the revisions you may have seen is, okay, it's not 1920, it's 1965 when women win the Voting Rights Act, or when people win the Voting Rights Act. Even that doesn't work, because there is no date when we actually are invested with a right to vote, which means we're constantly getting it taken away, or we're constantly gaining access again and then constantly getting it taken away again. And so this dynamic I've begun to call a kind of game of whack-a-mole. What's happened over US history is that states pop up a restriction, a social movement comes along and strikes down that very targeted restriction, but leaves open the infinite possibility for states to pop up more. And that's what's happening. So I want to point out that millions of women are voting before 1920. And that is here, all these salmon colored states, because again, states control this issue. So there's this thing called partial suffrage that we often forget about. All these states have already agreed to drop the word male, and all these other states that are not denim colored allow women to vote in certain kinds of elections. Only these denim colored states didn't allow women to vote before 1920, or didn't allow women to vote in any kind of election before 1920. So the point I want to make here is that millions of women are voting before 1920. Millions of women gain access because they were barred by this one word male. And millions of women don't gain access and still can't vote. And then we can't even just think about it as state laws. This is so complicated about when different people get voting access, because also there were many citizenship laws and that barred people from citizenship. Native Americans, Chinese Americans, Asian Americans, sometimes Indigenous Americans, Latinx people. So also whether or not one became a citizen mattered a lot. So we have to follow citizenship laws if we want to figure out when different people gained access to voting. And then even if you became a citizen, you had to look at your state laws. You might be able to vote in Illinois, but not be able to vote in Alabama based on what those states required of voting. And although we often think of the Voting Rights Act as kind of the culmination of everyone winning the right to vote, the Voting Rights Act also does not confer a right to vote. All it does is, again, go down to the South and say, we're going to bar these specific practices and we're going to beef up federal oversight. And that federal oversight, which has been largely successful, was destroyed in Shelby County v. Holder in 2013. And we can talk more about that Supreme Court case, but it gutted federal oversight of voting rights discrimination or voting access discrimination on the basis of race. And so now we have states once again popping up all kinds of voter restrictions that are almost always racially discriminatory. But those can't be stopped from going into effect. They can be charged afterwards. So we get voter ID laws, we get purging voter rolls, we get closing polling places, we get all kinds of things. So we are now in the midst of millions and millions of people gendered female not able to vote again. Okay, so what I'm trying to say is there's no point at which people get voting rights. That has never been won. And because of that, there's this game of whack-a-mole that keeps happening where people get access, lose access, get access, lose access. And finally, I want to point out that SCOTUS, the Supreme Court, has, in some ways, if we look at it this way, I think sometimes we think of 1920 as a story of change, right? And of voting rights in general in the United States as a story of change, and often one of opening progress. And thanks to the work of Alexander Keyssar, who's here with us today, he points out that it's, 2 steps forward and 2 steps back, that it's been this countervailing sense of these countervailing pressures. But in some ways, you can also see it as a story of stasis. If we go back to that second point I made, that there is no voting right, and if we start to differentiate what kind of voting right people have demanded across time, we see that SCOTUS has consistently denied people the ability to ask for a positive right to vote. People have done that across time. And I'm just now writing a history of that from 1776 to 2026. For the 250th anniversary. But the Supreme Court has consistently said in voting rights case after voting rights case, and this is a women's suffrage case, Minor v. Happersett, voting is a privilege and not a right. And they consistently say the Constitution provides no one with a right to vote. And so I hope those are all ways for you to think about how the story of so-called women's suffrage is actually part of a much larger story about women and voting rights, which is actually part of a much larger story about democracy in the United States, and history is living and present because that history is unfinished. It never finished up. It never won the kinds of things we want, and we are back still in fights for voting rights, partly because a voting right was never achieved. And so those are 4 reasons that I wanted to point out that I think the asterisk after 1920 reminds us that there are lots and lots of ways in which we need to continue to inflect the exceptions that we make to this 1920 story. Yes, 1920 was hugely important. Yes, 1920 matters, but it is not the center of this story in many ways. It's one piece of a much, much longer narrative. I now think of it as a middle rather than a beginning or an end. So I'll wrap up there. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. And now to the moderated conversation with Professor Keyssar. Just a reminder to the audience members that they can join the conversation by raising their blue hand or typing a question in the Q&A, and we shall get to that portion in a little while. Professor Keyssar.
Thank you, Kid, and thank you to Lisa and Allison for these 2 really very stimulating talks summarizing a lot of work that they have done. And, you know, as I try to step back in my role as moderator and as someone who has written a lot about these subjects, part of what's notable, we should underscore, is the advances that scholarship are producing in our understanding. I mean, what we are seeing here, what you've just seen in the last 40 minutes, is, you know, research and finding, you know, uncovering, well, I'm not sure it's uncovering new facts, but bringing things to the fore, which were on the sideline before, that just changed the shape of the story. And that's really what historians should be doing. And in Lisa's case, where she's trying to reconceptualize what a well-known narrative really looks like. I think in both cases, I think there's very interesting issues that we as historians have to think about, which is how best we can get our findings or new understandings reflected in popular culture and in popular accounts. I mean, you know, in some ways, I think although, you know, I wrote a book about all of this 20 years ago, and the book is pretty widely read, but in some ways what I refer to as the Congressional Quarterly version of the history of suffrage, which is things got better and then they got better and better and then they got better and better. That is still in many ways the dominant popular culture view of the history of the franchise. But you know, partly what I want to do here is just to commend Lisa and Alison, and they are speaking for really bodies of work that have been done. I also, before trying to encourage some dialogue between our 2 panelists, I wanted to amplify a little bit or extend some of the comments that Lisa made, and that are implicit in Allison's account as well. The fact is, voting rights is still an issue. Voting rights is still very much an issue. This is not a purely you know, historical subject. We know this. There are lawsuits over voting rights that were filed as recently as yesterday, and that is in part precisely because of something that Lisa mentioned, which is the absence of a federally guaranteed affirmative right to vote in the U.S. Constitution. Now, I do have to say, as a minor supplement to Lisa's comment, there is a right to vote in a lot of state constitutions. That is in there. It varies by the state and how it's worded, but it is in there. But the absence of a federal right to vote is not just striking if you compare this to most other nations, but it's very consequential. If lawsuits over the right to vote would look very different if there was a clause of the American Constitution, a provision in the United States Constitution that said every citizen of the United States shall have the right to vote in any election in the jurisdiction in which they live, period. Now, there are different ways to modify that. There are different wrinkles that can come up. And I can narrate, one experience that I had, which is that I was part of a relatively small group of people at the outset. It grew larger in the early 2000s, after the 2000 election. And we actually wrote a constitutional amendment saying something like that. We actually had several different variants of it because you bump into the question of felon disenfranchisement laws, which are different in different states. And then there's also the question of Guam and Puerto Rico. But the fact is, we wrote a constitutional amendment, and it was introduced in Congress. It was spearheaded by Congressman Jesse Jackson Jr., and it acquired at its peak 53 co-sponsors in the House, although no co-sponsors in the Senate, including a noted African-American senator from Illinois declined to co-sponsor it for us. This was Barack Obama. And what was part of, and we also tried to make this part of the platform of the Democratic Party in 2004, calling for a right to vote. And there's it was a complicated story, but in effect, and it's an interesting, fact about hardball politics, the chief reluctance within the Democratic Party to doing this was fear of opening up the issue of constitutional amendments at all, because they feared that there would be socially conservative amendments cutting in opposite directions if that issue got opened up. But I think that the absence of a right to vote in our Constitution, the presumption in the standard histories that things have just gotten better and better, and the only problems are sort of somewhere at the tiny margins. Those are things which I think we have to think seriously about. And my own view is that we have to work to change. The shifting gears here, I think maybe is part of the moderated discussion. The first question I would like to toss out to Alison and to Lisa is what questions you have for one another. When you listen, obviously, you're dealing with the same subjects, just taking different angles. And what questions would you like to pose? Alison, let me turn to you first. What questions do you have for Lisa? And then I'll ask Lisa.
Well, I guess, Lisa, I was thinking about this whole issue of whether and how I should change my language, and whether I should start talking more about gaining access to the vote rather than voting rights. And partly what I'm wondering about is, when I went back and I was looking at the primary source texts, even for today's talk, they all talk about voting rights. And so I'm just trying to figure out how you do that, where it's like maybe calling attention to the tension or the problem with the way that the activists themselves back then, but also still today, think about this. So is that your solution to the problem, is to kind of highlight the tension? Because I don't want to, the language is in our documents that were our historical documents. And so I want to keep some element of that. And I'd just be curious to know how you can help us think through this.
Yeah, it's not only in the call of the activists, it's in the amendment itself. The right to vote shall not be denied or abridged. But then it goes on to the negative language, right? And there is no legal grounding of that right to vote. I think what I'm doing, and I think everyone can make up their own mind, is just that my own sense is that thinking of a right to vote as something that we possess, which almost all Americans do think, handicaps us in being able to protect and exercise that right, not only ourselves, but make sure that other people's rights, or access to voting are protected. And I think that that concept, that there is a right to vote, has had tremendous power. That's part of why we get these negative amendments, right? Is because people do somehow have a faith that there is a right to vote that we ought to have, even if they're ignorant of the fact that it doesn't actually exist. then the other thing I think needs to happen is, both think about the power of that concept absent a legal grounding, right? That's kind of because I think the concept has been incredibly powerful and has brought about social change, right? Even though it is legally absent. And we never won quite what we thought a voting right was, but that language and that idea that we are vested with something has absolutely spurred social movements and spurred activists. Now, the second thing, though, that I think we need to do is always attend to how are they defining voting rights? That's, I think, the answer right there is what is the voting right that they're, because we, unfortunately, and they too, use that term so ubiquitously and so kind of generally that we all kind of assume we know what it refers to. And we don't actually know what it refers to often, or we don't bother to take the time. I shouldn't say we don't bother, but we forget to take the time to think, because the concept is so overriding and we all think we know what the concept is, right? Because it's such a powerful concept that we don't stop to ask, wait, how is this being defined? And even across the so-called women's suffrage movement, they are defining the right to vote in many different ways. Right. And I would argue that the ultimate definition that they pass in the 19th Amendment, they know it's not a positive right to vote, and they know it's vulnerable. And they do it anyway because they've just seen the 15th Amendment be undermined. They've just seen the danger of that. But they don't assert something more positive. And this is all over the documentary record too, because they know that they will not get support because it will mean that other people will get let in. And so I think the 19th Amendment has whiteness all over it, even though it doesn't mention race, right? So I think we have to ask, what is the right to vote that they're arguing for? And that would be my answer. And so I use that language, but then I say like, okay, defined legally how, right? And then my own preference for my definition of a right to vote is a positive right, an assertion. That's how I'm now using the term. And so I try to state that. But other people have used the term very differently. And I don't think there's a fixed definition, but I think that attending to the definition is critical.
We just add as a small supplement here, again, something that's implicit, but for members of the audience who may not know this, but that all federal amendments dealing with the right to vote, and in fact, there are multiple federal.
There are 4 of them, and they're all in the negative.
Right,
Yep.
they're all stated in the same language,
Yep.
which, among other things, reinforces repeatedly the notion that the right to that if voting, to the extent that voting is a right, it's granted by the state and not by the federal government.
Yep.
Alisa,
What's interesting is all those amendments say the right to vote shall not be denied or abridged.
Sure.
Yet, when people try to press that interpretation and it lands before the Supreme Court or other courts, the courts will push back and say that right to vote does not exist. It's merely a privilege, right? So what I'm saying is people have tried really hard to breathe life into that concept, and they've met with swift, absolute rejection and refusal. It's been really interesting. Like there's, the Reese case, there's so many cases where people try to breathe life into that first part of that amendment. I am invested with a right to vote. And the Supreme Court consistently comes back and the courts come back and say, no, you are not. It is a privilege. But that concept has had tremendous power across United States history. And is not a false concept, right? In that sense, that it doesn't have a legal grounding. So I'll say to Alison, I'm going to ask Les a question. Well, actually, I do have one question. I actually want to say a thanks for your tremendous biography. And I want to say a thanks to so many scholars during the centennial, because although I'm sitting here saying things that I'm trying to correct, I now, thanks to the work of you and many, many other people, Kathleen Cahill and, and Martha Jones, and just so many people, I am now having to rewrite all the other stuff that I'm not working on. And so I just the other day told the stupid story about the parade, and I'm like, I can't do that anymore. So there just are so many things that I feel like people contributed to the centennial that I'm still a sponge and soaking it all up and modifying my language in so many other areas and modifying my narrative in so many other areas based on the work that you and other people have done. And I'm so grateful for it. Maybe the question I would ask you is, why did it take so long to get a biography of Mary Church Terrell? She is so pivotal. And what's your sense of why do you suppose we didn't get one earlier?
Well, I think it might be that people thought they already knew enough about her, partially because looking mostly at her from the period of the 1890s when she's the first president of the National Association of Colored Women, and thinking about her as a kind of model of respectability and uplift politics, which she was. But what I try to argue is that she was a lot more than that, including at that exact time frame, but also throughout her very long 90 years of life. And so I think that there was a sense that she was not the kind of woman that we needed to look more at. And so Ida B. Wells Barnett is seen as the one who's kind of taking the fight up in a way that's more relevant for, let's say, the late 20th century, which is when a lot of the Black women's historians were taking on all of these really important issues. But she appears in many, many chapters and books about Black club women. She's everywhere, but the biography, she also has just an incredible amount of sources available. It's the opposite problem, but I almost feel like maybe that was overwhelming. Now it's digitized, and the Library of Congress, it's all digitized, so it makes it probably much easier to look through. Unfortunately, I finished before then, but I think the amount of material that's available at Howard University, at the Library of Congress, and now also at Oberlin contributes to maybe a sense that the story was maybe didn't need to be told, but then also is maybe too big to be told. I haven't really figured it out, but those are my two theories of what was going on.
In some ways, I mean, it's striking because I feel like a lot of that work is just coming out. I think of Jean Theo Harris's book on which is a couple of years ago now, but still, and people had the same attitude. And I heard her talk about this, was like, why would you write a biography of Rosa Parks? Because we already know Rosa Parks. And she's like, oh no, we don't, she's like, so maybe that, that sense that, and also the degree to which Black women have just not, if we think about all the work on Black women's intellectual history and all of that, not been seen as producers of original kind of thinking and thought, and in their full glory and in their full due. And we see Keisha Blaine's book and so much other work coming out right now that that basically says, Black women were not just trying to join white women, and they had their own political agendas that they wrote up and things. And so it's just interesting to see you also adding to that and just thinking how much of that history we have yet to recover. So.
Yeah, thanks.
It's a tremendous book. Thank you.
There is a question in the, or a comment in the question and answer thing. I don't know if we wanted to look at that.
Sure. Yeah, I was just reading it.
Okay. Do you want to
read it if that's all right?
Yeah.
So
sure.
We'll jump ahead to this and then we'll come back.
Go ahead.
All right. So this is from Paula Monopoli. Thanks to all the panelists. While there is no affirmative right to vote in the Constitution, the federal courts have recognized that voting is a fundamental political right. The problem seems to be that they require intentional discrimination rather than mere disparate impact in order to invalidate state voter ID laws and laws that restrict voting times and places. One way to address this issue, and the gutting of Section 2 of the VRA in the recent Supreme Court case, is to enact enforcement legislation pursuant to the 19th Amendment, which died in Congress in 1921. The Voting Rights Act does not include gender as a prohibited category. So perhaps it is time to address gendered voter suppression with enforcement legislation pursuant to the 19th Amendment for the very first time.
So I don't think that would solve the issue, because most of the discrimination in voting is happening along lines of race and has consistently throughout American history happened disproportionately along lines of race. And so I don't know that we need gendered enforcement so much as we just need enforcement and it's not entirely true that intention has to be shown. In some cases it does, but the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act, and maybe Alex can help me here, I think it was 82, I can't remember which reauthorization, or if it was 75, said that in fact, it changed the intent standard and said that in fact, if you could show that so the Voting Rights Act is about racial discrimination. It opens with, this is an act to enforce the 15th Amendment, right? That's what it's about. And one of the reauthorizations said, you do not need to show intent in order that to have a racially discriminatory effect, if there is a racially discriminatory effect, in fact, that is sufficient to strike down the law. So yes, I mean, the thing would be is who gets to enforce. And so, yes, we could have some enforcing legislation, and that's what, there's plenty of federal legislation before Congress right now about trying to strengthen people's rights to vote or people's voting access, right? What Congress is calling the right to vote. And what they're trying to do is say, well, at least in federal elections, you can't discriminate on these, on these grounds because we have but the problem is we still live in a federalist system whereby the states are allowed to control this issue to a fair degree. The 4 amendments that we have, which are race, sex, no poll taxes, and 18, the 4 constitutional amendments, all say Congress shall have the power to enforce this legislation. But one of the things they decided in Shelby County v. Holder is that this was a federal overreach into state prerogative. So Enforcement Act, yes, but then becomes the question of who has the right to enforce and who gets to enforce what, right? I mean, obviously what we see right now is that we don't all agree what's fair practice. And so it's hard to say who has the right to enforce, their practice. I don't know if the questioner wants to, her question has disappeared here, but Paula, did you want to type anything back in about that? Yes, there has been enforcement legislation along the way, but it gets tied up in this federalist fight over who has the right to enforce what, and has Congress overreached its power into it, what's technically a state prerogative still.
If I can overreach my role as moderator here, but just to come in, which is, I think it's important not to lose sight of the class dimension to voting rights restrictions.
Yep.
I think clearly race is extremely important, but voting restrictions were also very much aimed at working class people and poor people. Perhaps one of the most consequential literacy test requirements that was ever put in place in a state was New York's literacy test requirement, which was passed only in 1921 and remained in force until the mid-1960s. And its primary target was immigrants.
Yeah, thanks for doing. And Liette Gidlow's work here is tremendous. I mean, she's showing how this narrative that we have about voting rights and about the racial evolution of voting rights is entirely gendered, and also the ways in which, this was not just a Southern phenomenon, right? That New York had literacy tests and other things. But I absolutely. And one of the points of your book, The Right to Vote, Alex, is exactly that. Class matters tremendously here. I guess I would also add that class is often tied up with, economic and racial discrimination often go so tightly hand in hand, and immigrants were often seen as non-white, but absolutely this is also a class dynamic, and poor whites would sometimes be wrapped up in this, but yeah.
We have another question that says, here in your virtual host state of Massachusetts, the legislature of the Commonwealth has the authority so far not used to provide for compulsory voting. Is this a way forward to make universal voting the default position?
If I can come in on that one too, right, that the enabling legislation was put into the Mass Constitution in 1917. And my friend and colleague, Miles Rappaport, just testified to the state legislature in favor of, working on doing something with that enabling provision of the Constitution, so that Massachusetts would now create a compulsory voting option. I think there is a lot to be said for it. My own view. I'm interested in hearing what Lisa and Alison do, because for many reasons, I think that compulsory voting has shown elsewhere that it can be a very constructive thing, but also it changes the configuration of the notion of it, whether as a right or not, if you make it compulsory.
Yeah, and I would add to that, there are countries that do have compulsory voting, Australia being, the most notable. But one of the things we have to ask ourselves, is everyone going to have the equal opportunity to cast a vote, right? Because getting to the polls and being able to vote is much, much harder for some people than it is for others. So if we're going to have compulsory voting, I don't want to penalize people for whom it's so much harder to vote. So we should make sure we also make it, say, a national holiday, and that we provide, I don't know, free taxi rides for the day, you know, or that we open more polling places so that people don't have to travel super far if they don't have a vehicle. Do you see what I'm saying? So, I mean, sure, compulsory voting, but then we have to think about, does everyone have the same chance to be able to cast a vote? And is this going to pose a disproportionate burden on some people than others who will then likely be penalized for it? And that's just kind of an additional, you know, disenfranchisement. And, you know, so I'm for, and I would also say in terms of thinking about us globally, A, that we don't make voting a national holiday, B, we don't make it compulsory, and C, we are one of only about, of the 140 or so constitutional democracies around the globe, we stand nearly alone in not having a right to vote for citizens, in a positive right to vote in the Constitution. So I would also say that's weird, right? That makes us an unusual democracy, just by way of comparison. Yeah.
I do notice that Susan had her hand up, but I don't know if she still does. I got the impression that Kid had said that people could unmute themselves and ask a question. But since I don't see the hand up anymore, maybe that's not relevant. Paula said, thanks all. The new state voter ID and time restrictions have a disparate impact on all women, given name changes, the gender pay gap, the disproportionate childcare issues. Yep. And this is especially true for women of color. So I think that the congressional enforcement legislation would help with those cases. And Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which did establish more of a disparate impact test, was also diluted by Justice Alito in the recent Brnovich case. So intentional discrimination is still very salient in voting rights cases. Thanks to all three of you for your books and for this discussion.
Thanks, Paula, for all those suggestions. I think it's going to be a huge democratic debate about how do we move forward and how do we make people's voting rights, people's voting access stronger, right? And those are all important suggestions. So thanks. It might also be interesting to hear from the audience, if I might pose a question. I mean, you're here to talk about what, you know, to sort of assess what happened during the centennial and how has the dialogue changed. And it would be really interesting to hear from people who were not scholars in the middle of this, or perhaps many of the people on here were. What did you learn during the centennial? How did your narratives change? And where has your own thinking gone over this time period? It would be really interesting for me to hear that from folks here. If people are willing to, maybe people could type into the Q&A. There are things that we can kind of read them out loud. People could unmute themselves.
They can type into the Q&A or raise their hands, and we have to unmute them.
Gotcha.
But,
okay. Yeah. Well, while we're waiting to see if somebody does that, I wanted to mention that some of the other things that we didn't even get to talk about, but that I think that the conference really highlighted last year, were various other kinds of issues that had to do a lot with actually questions about suffrage and notions about sexuality and gender and race, and how they combined to keep people out of access of the right to vote, right? In the sense that there was a lot of concern about interracial marriage, or ideas about sexual danger and perversity, of like, how do we characterize those people who want to vote, and how do we keep it seeming like something that should be a privilege only for a few? And there was also a lot of talk about upholding female domesticity and respectability, and then all of the social equality fears that played into racism and fed into an anti-voting access position. And it seems to me that those were some of the issues that the papers that we heard last year were talking about. It looks like maybe we have a comment from Corey.
Okay.
So thank you for these wonderful talks, so interesting. Lisa, why do you think the 15th Amendment included the phrase, the right to vote? Did Republicans get this phrase from the states? Did they take the language from activist strategies, or what?
I don't know why it's in there, but I think that they were animated exactly as we are, that was the frame in which they understood this stuff. That was the language you used. That's the language we use. That's the language all the activists used. But then how do they define the right to vote, right? They define it as the state shall not deny or abridge on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So I think, and maybe Alex, knows more here about how the 15th Amendment, I know that it was backdoor deals kind of at the final hour, but go ahead, Alex.
Well, what I was going to say was not about the 15th Amendment per se, although yes, there was originally a much better version of the 15th Amendment, which passed each branch of Congress separately, which would have banned all sorts of discrimination. But what I was going to say here was that the phrase "the right to vote" shows up in state constitutional conventions as early as the 1820s. Not talking about women's suffrage per se, but really talking about property requirements. So the phrase, and I know it shows up as early as 1819, 1821. My guess is that it shows up earlier. So it has become a vernacular,
absolutely
common phrase, before the 1850s.
Right. And what I'm trying to get people, what I was trying to call for was not that we nail it down as meeting X or Y, but ask ourselves, what did they mean when they use the right to vote, rather than assuming that we know what they, because I think we're assuming kind of the wrong thing, right? That it is this right to vote that we imagine, which is something that somebody possesses. So but that concept it'd be interesting to write a kind of intellectual history of the right to vote and the power that it's had across time, even as in the sense that I'm defining it, it didn't exist legally. I also wanted to go give a shout out to some new work that's coming out by Carol Faulkner and Andrew Cohen on cross-dressing voters or trans voters throughout the 19th Amendment, which is something we don't think, speaking of sexuality and other things. Andrew and Carol have both found that there are numerous examples well before 1848 of people cross-dressing, people who would have been, identified as female at birth, but for whatever reasons were presenting male, voting, and then being found out. And, thanks to the gift of digitized newspapers, we can now discover so much more that we couldn't before. So, there's also that kind of history, and we have to think about, okay, where does that fit? It's not exactly women's suffrage history, but it is about gender and voting. So.
And Paula Austin has a comment that she's answering your question, Lisa, saying there have been so many amazing new books, including Martha Jones's and Lauren Santangelo's book about New York City and the use of the city in organizing decisions. And she says that her teaching has really benefited from the nuanced stories and language to help students understand this history and where we've come since then and where we are in the continued fight to expand access. But then also Paula, there's another Paula Monopoly who has her hands up. So if you want to unmute yourself, or if Kid could unmute you.
Can I speak to Paula for a minute too, the Austin? So yes, and I'm so glad that all these books, but when you talk about this, the role of the city in organizing decisions, absolutely. And I think what a lot of the new books have done is take us down from this one perch of the 1920 and just into all the messy chaos on the ground and the role of, and so suddenly the narrative is a lot less neat, right? And I'm glad that you're finding ways to teach about it. But I know that for high school teachers, this is particularly problematic right now, right? Because they need a good clean through line to be able to tell, in the one, the 10 minutes that they have on this in the year. And so it's also interesting to think about where we're going to land in terms of what is this going to look like in the kind of high school version of all of this. So go ahead.
Hi guys, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, sorry, I got bumped off. I had to get back on the Zoom. I just wanted to say thank you to all three of you for your work over this couple of years. All your books have been incredibly helpful. And, I think the thing that I learned most, I had an inkling about the broader movement in terms of African-American suffragists, but your work, both of your work, Alison and Lisa, has been incredibly helpful that way in understanding how critical it was and how essential that tension was in the movement itself. And then in I made the point about enforcement legislation. The reason that enforcement legislation died in committee was in large part because of a fear of the 15th Amendment, right? It was white Southern politicians pushing back against first the 19th, and then when they lost that battle, then they fought back successfully against the congressional efforts to get a 19th Amendment enforcement bill out. And then Alex, your work in terms of the broader picture, I had no idea about alien suffrage, for example. And your point about class is really well taken. And I think we're still seeing that with the gendering of voter suppression today, which is rarely talked about in terms of its impact, these state laws, which are restricting time, place, and manner regulations. So, it's a really, I think, it's been a rich couple of years in terms of the scholarship. So thank you all.
Thank you. I'm not sure who's in charge here. I'm assuming it's Kid, but
we currently do not have any additional questions or comments, although Paula Austin, thanks you both for your books. Thank you, Alison, for the great book on Tetrault. I especially appreciated learning so much more about her life and secret relationship. And thank you both for a great conversation. So that's the last comment. We'll continue with the conversation, and I'll let you know if there are any other comments from the audience.
I guess a question that I would pose to Alison and Lisa, or just is just where do you think that writing and research should go from here? I mean, if you have, graduate students or young scholars who approach you, are there particular veins, particular terrains that you think it would be fruitful for people to explore?
Well, I really do think that Black women's history is still highly understudied, and that there's a lot more room and space for us to learn about women who appear very peripherally in a lot of the stories, but who were fighting for all kinds of access to voting, for enforcement of laws, for, to basically, especially the way that they were very suspicious of states' rights and very much insisting upon a strong role of the federal government, partially because of their experience with Southern states' restrictions upon so many aspects of African Americans' lives and autonomy. And so it seems to me that doing that on the ground work of uncovering these women whose lives are still yet to be uncovered is important for not just the story of suffrage, but just more generally. And that is something that I guess I see as a priority going forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think I would join that comment and say that one of the big problems, I think, with the narrative that we've had, an anonymous attendee just wrote in, my vision of the women's suffrage movement had always been upper class urban white women, and the studies over the last year or so have broadened that immensely and made me question why I ever had that vision to begin with. And I would say partly because it was by far the most dominant narrative. And I think what's happened in the scholarship for a long time and in popular lore has been that we've treated this kind of as two tracks. There's the women's suffrage track and the kind of Black suffrage track. And women has tacitly meant white, and Black suffrage has tacitly meant male. And so Black women have fallen out. And we've had this thing as if these two stories exist on parallel tracks and don't intersect. And of course, Black women are the living embodiment of that intersection, but also all of the people involved in that struggle. And I think Paula Mapoli, or one of the comments she just made about, I think one of the things we have to point out is that we have to stop talking about gender as an isolated variable, because gender is not an isolated variable, and also in white women's lives, not just in the lives of women of color. They are acutely aware of gender, and they are acutely aware of their own whiteness, and they are working to advance it and forward it. And I think that we have to start thinking about the 19th Amendment and their demands and other things as acquiescing to white supremacy and acquiescing to whiteness, and not wanting to, upset the apple cart in terms of race. And I would just point out, here's she said, when they couldn't defeat the 19th Amendment, then they, but here's congressmen on the floor during the debate on the 19th Amendment, right? Basically saying, I'm good with it because the state restrictions we've just put in place will mean that this is just for white women. And so essentially, that we just finished doing, and I think part of the reason the 19th Amendment passes when it does, and we almost never talk about this, is because the states have just finished disenfranchising, right? The states have just put in place laws, not just in the South, right, that will impose literacy tests and poll taxes on people of color. And so now Congress is like, okay, we'll do that because it won't have racial implications, right? So here's congressmen on the floor during the debate. One crowed that any person who really wants white supremacy in the South cannot better guarantee it than by enacting this equal suffrage resolution. In other words, right, it was going to double the right vote. And so he's like, if you want white supremacy in the states, you should support women's suffrage. And now we know that, violated. But here's what another one said: the situation as to Negro women can be handled the same as it was with Negro men. And another reminded his colleague, it is inconceivable that these conditions will be destroyed or interfered with by permitting women to vote. In other words, they very clearly on the floor knew that this was a white, So we have to stop only thinking about race existing too, where people of color are concerned, and start bringing the question of race into the evolution and the story of the 19th Amendment itself and of white suffragists. And I think, that intersectionality has not yet touched, I think, a lot of the white narrative about suffrage. So.
Mm-hmm. And Lynn Eckert has a really good point where she says that as a bit of an outsider, she examined the role of a profession, medicine, as an example, to determine if women professionals, Black and white, engaged in suffrage or failed to do so as they were so involved in their own battles for rights in their profession, so as to be at the margins of suffrage. And she would like more people to be doing research on other professionals so that we can get a better understanding of how these things intersect and connect, which I think is an excellent point.
Yeah. And then Peter Drummey just wrote in one of the revolutions that, by the way, hi, Peter, it's been a long time. A revelation I was a fellow at the Mass Historical Society many, many years ago. A revelation during the past year is a powerful role of images, especially political cartoons, have been in these campaigns. And yeah, there we should give a shout out both to the person who curated the exhibit at the Mass Historical and who's written a powerful book on the role of images, which is Allison Lang, and her Picturing Political Power, which is directly above Allison's head on the screen here. So yeah. So I would definitely give a shout out to her work on images, which are hugely important, and the ways in which many, were designed to try to show suffragists as not abandoning their domestic or maternal duties, if they became suffragists. So.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And this idea that showing women as masculinized if they voted, and then men as feminized if they voted, is definitely part of this very important way that ideas about gender and rigidity about gender play into all kinds of social anxieties. And so really what it shows me is, what are people anxious about and what are they worried about, and how does that play out? And it seems like it's not unconnected to the kind of transphobia that we see today, where the concerns are about the so-called rights of trans people somehow being a threat. And then especially if you can connect it to children, or to bathrooms, or to sites of anxiety, kind of cultural anxiety. And so at the time, definitely voting and voting rights, ideas about that tapped into these anxieties about social hierarchy, and the cartoons really are very blatant about this. And even in terms of the way that they caricatured African Americans as looking supposedly like, African savages, with these kind of stereotypes where all of a sudden somebody who is an enslaved man like Robert Terrell, Mary Church Terrell's husband, who was part white and part Black because of white men's rape of Black women during the time of enslavement, he's depicted as basically every single stereotype that they can come at him from Africa to try to keep him from being a judge, because he got appointed as municipal court judge and it was seen as such a threat. So these things are not unconnected, and the cartoons really highlight, I think, the way that these anxieties are in place. And definitely Alison Lang's book on picturing suffrage has a lot of those images that mobilized people to oppose suffrage and to support it.
Have what I think will be the last question here from Carol Faulkner, one of our presenters in the conference. Thank you for the great talks and interesting conversation. It seems like the sesquicentennial was overlooked compared to the centennial. What other history should we be writing about the 15th Amendment?
Yeah.
Well, I do think that we want to be thinking about race and how that played in, and especially in terms, I guess what I was trying to show is the way that the 19th Amendment and the 15th Amendment were not inseparable for Black women. And so from that point, I do think that Black women's historians have been trying to do that and to make those links happen between those two things.
Yeah, and I would say that they were not inseparable for white women either, right? I mean, the entire evolution of the language of the 19th Amendment is absolutely dependent on the racial context of the United States, right? And the way that they make their arguments, the Southern strategy, where they're like, as the South is casting about for a way to disenfranchise Black men before they come up with poll taxes and literacy tests, you've got white suffragists pouring into the South saying, enfranchise us, we'll drown. I mean, race is just central to the entire thing. And the 15th Amendment is inseparable in the history of race, and that is inseparable from the 19th Amendment. But I do think that it would be really interesting. I think of, I'm sorry, it's a name I don't know how to pronounce, but it's over my shoulder, but the Black suffrage book by, The Trial of Black Republic, The Trial of Democracy, Black Suffrage, and some other really great books about the 15th Amendment, including Alex's. I do think it would be really interesting to start writing some histories of how and why the 15th Amendment ends up taking on the language that it does. And we've got Eric Foner's recent second founding. There's a lot of work on that, but I do think attending again to this question of defining what a right to vote means and how did it come to be defined that way. And, as Foner points out in Second Founding, it was largely a, it wasn't exactly done with like, intense, what's the word I'm looking for? It was kind of a late night backdoor deal, right? So, but I think how the 15th Amendment and how, there's really great work too on the 15th Amendment about how freed people and others try to breathe life into that amendment and how absolutely the Supreme Court shuts that down, right? You will not breathe life in as this gives you a right to vote, no.
If I can add something to that, which is something I alluded to before, which is that I think that there is work to be done. It's of a strange, on one level, it's kind of an elite political history, but is to try to understand how the 15th Amendment got gutted from being the much more encompassing amendment that it was, which was not just about race.
Yep.
Right. The standard history of it is, yes, well, we got this thing about race. Well, within Congress, majorities at both points approved amendments that said that education, religion, ethnicity, and financial requirements. It was basically trying to eliminate all such restrictions on voting, and then in a conference committee, this is very reminiscent of like Congress today. Things are deadlocked that went into a conference committee, and we ended up with this much more narrow amendment, so narrow that some very, very prominent politicians actually refused to vote for the 15th Amendment in the Senate. Some of the leading abolitionists of the time who thought that other protections were needed. So, and we're looking at the connections between race and other dimensions of life. And I think we need to find out more about that story.
Yeah, here I'm just going to read one of the versions that George Julian proposed. This was one that he proposed, a possible 15th Amendment proposed December 8th, 1868. The right of suffrage in the United States shall be based on citizenship, and all shall be regulated by Congress, and all citizens of the United States, whether native or naturalized, shall enjoy this right equally. History would have looked very different after this if that had been the amendment that we had passed. The other thing I want to give a shout out to that I think is going to be really important for how we start thinking about the 15th Amendment, but I don't think we've fully gotten there yet, is the work recently of Kate Mazur, Van Goss, and other things looking at the civil rights activism of African Americans in the North around voting and other things that I think sometimes we think of the 15th Amendment as kind of a congressional creation. And I think in many ways what they're showing is that this has a long history again of African American activism and intellectual history behind it.
Well, we are at 3:31, so we're 1 minute over, but I wanted to give all of you a chance to have a last word, maybe some parting comments before we conclude.
Thank you for putting this together.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you so much. This was a wonderful conversation, and thanks to everyone who participated and asked questions or made comments. It was really interesting.
Yeah, likewise, my thanks, and also my regrets that when we had postponed this a year ago, we were certain we'd be in person, and here we are yet again. But I'm delighted to be with everyone. Thank you for the discussion and the chance to assess.
Okay, take care.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Bye.